Did you know that 20% of the American Jewish community is effectively excluded from leadership and professional positions? Their personal voice is not at the table. Community organizations and programs are able to refuse their participation, and there is not an active effort to nurture and train this 20% to represent themselves as leaders in our communal structure. This impacts at least 1 in 5 Jewish families, maybe more. What if we lost 20% of all American Jews from the community? Are we willing to do that? This is what is happening to members of the Jewish community who live with disabilities. They currently see a community structure which does not represent them. In the 2018 Jewish Disability Inclusion Survey by Respectability, only 15% of Jews with disabilities knew anyone with a disability in leadership. The Jewish respondents with disabilities point to a lack of people with disabilities in leadership roles as clergy or staff at Jewish institutions, and do not fully feel welcome to serve as leaders in lay positions in the Jewish community either. So I ask you, would we give up on any other 20%? Could we exclude a different 20%? What if we excluded, say, all Jews ages 55 to 64? All who identified with the conservative Jewish movement? It would never happen. Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, the president of Respectability, wisely said, "If you see it, you can be it." Today, Jews with disabilities need more role models with disabilities in leadership in the Jewish community. Many also want to be recruited, trained, and empowered to make the Jewish community stronger themselves, just like everyone else. Best practices and expectations in the disability world have moved from simply serving people with disabilities separately to inclusion of all people of all abilities in everything. The American Jewish community is not at this level. Rabbi Dov Linzer reminds us, the world is not divided into those with disabilities and those without. It is divided into those with disabilities and those who do not yet have a disability. Disability shows up in many forms, visible and invisible, short and long term, impacting physical development or intellectual capacity. The current situation, one without true representation by individuals with disabilities at the table, does not have to continue. The Jewish community must embrace the mantra of the larger disability community: nothing about us, or people with disabilities, without us, or people with disabilities. These empowering words express the conviction of people with disabilities that they do know what is best for them. It ignites a vision for people with disabilities that represents pride and power rather than stigma and pity. The phrase reinforces the possibilities for people with disabilities to be meaningfully included, and if they wish to, seamlessly become leaders in every type of organization and institution. It is possible in the American Jewish community. What we need is inclusive leadership, which is defined in the handbook, Inclusive Leadership, a theoretical framework, as having the courage to take conscious steps to break down barriers for people at risk of being excluded from society. Inclusive leaders embody a leadership approach that appreciates diversity, invites and welcomes everyone's individual contribution, and encourages full engagement with the process of decision-making and shaping reality. The aim of inclusive leadership is to create, change, and innovate while balancing everybody's needs. The first and most important element is acknowledging and valuing everybody's inherent worth. This means a shift in focus from seeing people's deficits to looking at their resources and qualities. Psychologist Edwin Hollander writes, "Inclusive leadership is about relationships that can accomplish things that are mutually beneficial. Reaching leadership at this level means doing things with people rather than to people. People with disabilities have a voice that should and must be at the table from the beginning of the planning process. It should never simply be an afterthought. Do we have this now? Rarely. We are missing a huge voice and a huge segment of the Jewish community by not including this 20% around the table. But if we look at Jewish teachings and values, you can see that inclusive leadership is the intended model for our community. One of our greatest examples of leadership, Moses, clearly struggles with a speech impediment and whether the limitation should exclude him from potential leadership. God clearly shuts down this idea and reinforces that all community members have the eligibility to lead. In Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 through 11, we hear, "But Moses said to the Lord, 'Please, O Lord, I have never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue.' And the Lord said to him, 'Who gives man speech? Who makes him dumb or deaf, blind or seeing? Is it not I, the Lord?' Despite his protests, Moses ends up delivering the most celebrated address in Jewish history, the book of Deuteronomy. A man who first protested his inability to speak, eventually utters some of the most influential and enduring words of Jewish scripture. Are the opportunities the same and open to Jews with disabilities in our community today? All too often, Jewish communities still imagine people with disabilities only in the pews and not on the bima. Core Jewish values also remind us that inclusive leadership and participation should always be the default. The principle of B'Tselem Elohim, our intrinsic human value, underscores that all human beings mirror the infinite and that there is an unbreakable link between being and worth. What message is being sent through the essential exclusion of the disabled community? What does it say about their worth and value as compared to the rest of the community? It sends the message that they are less important, less valued, and of less worth than another community member without a disability. And if we look at the principle of arevut, the notion that Jews are a single people whose members have an obligation to care for one another. Beyond the bonds that link any individual family, arevut recognizes a deep sense of responsibility for the welfare of everyone in the community. To be a people is to bear responsibility for the well-being of all members. This is the picture of true acceptance and focus on creating a meaningful and involved life for all. Leaving many community members outside looking in is not an option. By excluding this 20% of the community, we may not only face losing their voice around the table, but also the voice of their family members who often choose to opt out of community involvement when they have a family member or loved one who has experienced exclusion or rejection. This also should not be an option. Inclusion is not a program. The voice of the disabled should be included in all areas of our organizations, including leadership. Mia Mingus, author of Changing the Framework, Disability Justice, says, "Inclusion is a way of thinking. It is how we behave and treat one another. It is a philosophy that embraces the idea that everyone has something of value to contribute and that everyone has a right to belong." And what about modern leadership models? What do they say? What benefit is seen from truly inclusive leadership? Jim Collins, in his Level 5 leadership model, pushes toward the following components of highly functional leadership in organizations, which include rejecting a single leader model, forming and nurturing relationships, and building diverse teams. This clearly aligns with both the traditional Jewish models of effective communal leadership and the inclusive leadership model. The value of inclusion and diversity far outweighs any benefit that exclusion might bring. It increases creativity, problem solving, and success. By fully embracing the inclusive leadership model, the Jewish community would affirm a model of community that values the way people tend to one another's needs and foster each other's well-being through relationships and interdependence. These human bonds of mutuality and care enrich everyone's lives. When we recognize interdependence, Mia Mingus writes, we are inscribing community on our skin. So how do we get there? How do we shift Jewish communal leadership structures to an inclusive model in the 21st century? First, we truly need a grassroots call to action to ensure leadership of our organizations is truly representative of our community, and that those with disabilities are accepted and meaningfully included in all organizational levels. All community members should be asking questions of the organizations that you're involved with. Questions such as, does this organization have policies that support meaningful inclusion of people with disabilities at all levels, both as participants, leaders, and employees or professionals? Do all the programs and projects include people with disabilities? If more is needed in order to truly welcome, recruit, and serve people with disabilities, how does the organization plan to achieve those goals? Secondly, our Jewish communal organizations need to work to uproot the unconscious bias on disability. Suzanne Feinsman wrote, in Strategies to Address Unconscious Bias in Our Leadership, even with the best intentions, unconscious bias is so powerful and impactful and persuasive, it impacts all of our decisions and actions without our knowing it. It is a product of long-held assumptions about who leaders are and what they look like. We need to make sure that all leaders whose identities are underrepresented and often invisible in our Jewish communal story are no longer an afterthought. To create a more representative and inclusive community means recruiting more disabled people to serve in leadership positions, on boards, and in professional roles. Organizations must strategically and intentionally address how their culture either encourages or discourages participation by people with disabilities. And third, we need to make inclusion automatic and create a training pipeline for those with disabilities towards leadership. This means starting with our youth and young adult programming in the Jewish community. Youth and young adult programming and engagement are the entry points for many into the Jewish community, into the pipeline towards leadership opportunities in the future. Often, more often than not, disabled individuals are excluded. They're separated into special programs that rarely focus on leadership skill development or leadership development opportunities. But as Hal Lewis said, leaders are made, not born. If the end goal is inclusive adult leadership, the community must begin by finding ways to truly accept, support, nurture, and mentor young people with disabilities so that they can begin to develop the skills and knowledge that they will need to be impactful voices around the table in the future. Taking these steps will allow the American Jewish community to achieve both short-term and long-term positive impact. In the short term, we align our communications and programming with our values and create spaces that are more welcoming and inclusive to those Jews who often find themselves on the margins of our community. Effectively, we must stop the exclusion. In the long term, we will move the community ever closer to becoming a fully welcoming, inclusive, and equitable community where every Jew, regardless of disability or ability, can bring their full selves to the table and make the strongest contribution to our collective success.